Alejandro is a lifelong resident of Dodge City, the son of immigrants from Mexico, and last year, as he turned 18, he was preparing to vote for the first time. Alejandro was the student body president of his high school. He took his right to vote very seriously. When the county clerk closed the only polling site and opened a new polling site in an inaccessible location on the edge of town, he fought for his right to vote. He ultimately became, He ultimately became one of the co-plaintiffs in an ACLU suit to block this attempt to disenfranchise voters. Alejandro is here today to share a little bit of his story with you. Alejandro?
All right, well, I want to start off by saying thank you all for the opportunity to speak alongside Brett Parker, Mark Johnson, and Jamie Shew. It's an incredible honor to share the same stage with exemplary elected officials. Let's give them a round of applause for all of you. So I've been in college for about 4 weeks now, and let me tell you, it's hit me like a truck. Florence is different than Dodge in many ways, but what's stayed constant is that people are still very nice. Something's never changed in this great state of ours. I'm here to talk to you about my hometown of Dodge City, which you may know for the Wild West stories that came from it in the late 1800s, the show Gunsmoke, or even our voting rights issues from 2018. Today I'm going to give you all the congressional treatment for the next paragraphs, are the same ones I uttered while testifying before the Committee on House Administration in Washington, D.C., where I so romantically spent Valentine's Day this year. I'd like to start with my parents. Martin and Lucio Rangel are immigrants from the states of Guerrero and Veracruz, respectively, and they came to the United States for the same reason that everyone else did, and continues to do so, to reach for a dream that isn't attainable where they're from. That dream led them to the city that I call home, to work in the 2 beef packing plants that fuel the economy of Southwest Kansas. By no means is this story unique. Thousands of people from every corner of the world have arrived in Dodge City to forge their own path, to pull themselves up, and to create a better future for their children. Being a first-generation Mexican-American, I grew up figuring out what that meant. I celebrated Dia de los Muertos. I grew up with the traditions that my parents instilled in me, while also learning English in preschool and the origin of this great nation. I sang the Kansas State song Home on the Range on Kansas Day, and over many years concluded that nothing beats a Kansas sunset. But I can't say there haven't been any issues. For 2 decades, Dodge City only had 1 polling place for nearly 13,000 voters, and while that's bad enough to make it one of the most heavily burdened polling places in the state, it was at the very least centrally located, which can't be said about the location that was chosen for the 2018 midterm elections. It was located south of town, out of city limits, a mile from the closest bus stop. Worse, the county clerk sent out the wrong address to new voters, sending them to a now closed polling location. I fully expected to cast my first vote at the Civic Center, where I'd watched my dad vote every election year that I can remember. But this new site wasn't accessible by public transportation before we raised concerns. We believed these factors would negatively impact minority and low-income voters. I could not sit idly by as it happened. For a long time, other community members had voiced concerns to the county clerk about having only 1 polling site, but their words fell on deaf ears. After years of failed attempts to contact our clerk about finding a resolution before the election, I, along with the League of United Latin American Citizens, became plaintiffs in a lawsuit challenging the clerk's actions and asking for a resolution before midterms. While we were unsuccessful in finding relief for the midterms, it played a pivotal role in pushing her to open the 2 new polling sites that are located within city limits. We rely on our elected officials to make the right choices, and for a county clerk, that job was to make voting as accessible as possible in the county that she represents. Unfortunately, that's not what happened, and the issue necessitated national attention or nearly $100,000 in taxpayer money for legal fees, fighting our efforts to make polling places more accessible. The story I just described to you is not unique either. people across the country from Georgia to North Dakota to Texas and our home state have made it more difficult for citizens to vote rather than expanding our democracy. We often think that the biggest threat to the American electoral system is a foreign threat, and while those concerns are justified, it's also true that many of the measures undermining voter access are being committed by the very elected officials or selected officials to protect people's voting rights. It's way too common to think that voting rights violations are something that only happens in those faraway places I just mentioned, but the reality is much closer than you think. You are only one cruddy Secretary of State or County Clerk away from a Dodge City level mess. Our issues out in western Kansas haven't ended, nor will they without action. In liberal Kansas, another minority-majority community in southwest Kansas, their county clerk is doing the same thing we fought against, and that is limiting the voting power of our black and brown brothers and sisters by allowing only a single polling site for their community of 20,000 people. Enough is enough. The national rhetoric lately has been that wealthy suburbs are the key for Democrats to win state and national races, and while that isn't a bad thing by any means, they failed to mention Black, Latino, and Asian communities that are too often targeted by Republicans for disenfranchisement. As these populations continue to grow, particularly in western Kansas, we cannot forget them. We can't afford to forget them. Our success in Kansas requires people from across the state from many different backgrounds. The Democratic Party prides itself on its big tent. Let's not lose sight of that. Prosperity in Kansas relies on the accountant from Johnson County as much as it does on the farmer in Johnson City on the western edge of our state. I'm proud of my rural roots, and I can't wait for the experiences I'll get here in Lawrence. We're doing great, but we can do even better. Adelante and happy Hispanic Heritage Month. Thank you.
County Democrats. I guess that's a great introduction to why today's presentation is relevant and why it matters. The title today is Election Reform Efforts in Kansas, Expanding and Protecting Our Access to Our Most Fundamental Right. I'll ask our speakers to come forward. The moderator will be in the middle. And I have just a few words to say and to introduce folks, and then we will get started. I will note that we're doing good on time today. Sometimes we're not so good. And the speakers would like to talk for 3 hours. So I assured them that 3 hours was not possible, but we got a lot to listen to, and I think this is going to be a good one. So enjoy, and we'll try and go to 11:15. Or a little less, okay? If they run out and you guys run out of questions, so be it. Our conversation today is going to be moderated by Mark Johnson, attorney and KU law professor. Our presenters are Jamie Shew, Douglas County Clerk and Clerk of Elections, and Brett Parker, Kansas representative from Overland Park. Let me share a little bit of information about the speakers, and then we will begin in what will be a very engaging and enlightening conversation. These guys are the professionals on the front, fighting to make and keep our right to vote safe. Mark Johnson has been a partner in Denton US LLP since 1994, helping to found the Kansas City office. Mark's practice is concentrated in the areas of telecommunication law, First Amendment, employment relations, and election law campaign finance. A graduate of Yale undergraduate and Harvard Law School, he is also on the faculty of the KU Law School. In addition to teaching law courses in election law and the First Amendment, he teaches undergraduates in the School of Journalism and a freshman seminar in the honors program. He, in fact, just left a session today with freshman honors students to be with us. And I'm going to say that not only was he already working this morning, but he also, when he came and engaged Alejandro in conversation, some of that was about voting, and some of that was a very gentle faculty member mentoring a new student, and that was pretty cool. Mark is a member of the board of ACLU of Kansas and has been for a number of years. He represents plaintiffs in voting rights cases in Kansas, where he has successfully countered Chris Kobach's voter suppression efforts in court, including being a lead attorney in the Fish versus Kobach trial. He has also worked with Alejandro in the suit brought by ACLU in Dodge City. Next up is Jamie Shew. He was elected County Clerk, County Election Officer for Douglas County in 2004. He is currently in his 4th term in office. Prior to his election, he worked in higher education administration and business management. He's active in Election Center, IAGO, GFOA, Kansas Association of Counties and Kansas County Clerks and Election Officials Association, where he served as president in 2014-15. Jamie has achieved Master County Clerk status in Kansas and earned National Certified Election Registration Administrator status in 2017. Since taking office, he has led a redesign of the Douglas County Clerk's office, focusing on accessibility, organizational effectiveness, and efficiency. He's been recognized for his innovative initiatives to potential voting barriers, including creation of the Douglas County Voter ID and the Birth Certificate Assistance Program. Jamie is an advocate in promoting legislation and policies which improve access to the ballot while securing the election process. Jamie has provided leadership in implementing a new integrated financial system in Douglas County. His efforts were recognized by the Lawrence Douglas County League of Women Voters Helen Fluker Award for Open and Transparent Government. Jamie has presented to local, state, and national audiences on a variety of election topics, sharing his passion for election administration. He has a BS in political science from Missouri State University and an MPA from the University of Kansas. He grew up in a small town in Missouri, but seems to have made his way across the border and has made Lawrence home, where he's active with Douglas County 4-H, Leadership Lawrence, Plymouth UCC Church, and running kids around town. He and his wife, Dawn, have 3 wonderful children, Jake, Annie, and David, and a growing menagerie of pets. Jamie. And I was going to say to our left, but I don't know if that I will speak to that, so I'll let Brett speak to that. We are proud that Brett Parker is proud to represent Kansas House District 29, so he is a neighbor of ours. In the Kansas legislature, Brett serves on the Higher Education Budget Committee, the Appropriations Committee, and is the ranking minority member of the Elections Committee. He's a strong and vocal proponent for integrity in elections, having introduced an amendment to the Kansas Constitution that would ensure a fair selection process of those in charge of redistricting, avoiding the threat of gerrymandering. Brett works ardently on behalf of teachers and students, mental health, women's rights, and for all the people in the 29th District. Born and raised in Johnson County, Brett Parker is a graduate of Olathe East. He has worked in the very same school district, teaching English at Countryside Elementary School and Pioneer Trail Middle School. An alumnus of UMKC, Brett is currently an active member of the Kansas National Education Association and has served as vice president and national delegate for the Olathe National Education Association. In that role, he champions students, their families, and the teachers that serve them while working collaboratively with the superintendent and Olathe Board of Education. Brett has been involved in social justice reform at a local church to educate students about the struggles of their peers around the world. In 2008, he organized the Abolition Relay at the Kansas Marathon to raise money for International Justice Mission. Locally, Brett is best known for his creation of Dressed to the Nines Day, an annual event which helps to raise money for the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City, and was formally adopted by the Kansas City Royals. Brett is in his 2nd term in the legislature and is running for re-election in 2020 with the hopes of continuing his good work for the betterment of Kansas. I have to do not a mic drop, but a mic switch. So I'm gonna have to unplug this switch, this mic, give it to you guys, And then we'll get to hear from the experts. Thank you. It's easier than I thought.
This one works.
Okay, and so well, you got two now, 2 for 3 people.
Okay.
Okay.
I guess I get to keep this one. And you guys can pass it back and forth. Good morning. It's wonderful to be here. Before I get into the program, I should tell you the last time I was on this stage was for, I think, the annual dinner for the museum, the Lawrence Arts Center. I thought I was being recruited to be on the board. It turns out I was actually auditioning, because that was 6 years ago, and I still haven't heard if I've made it to the board. But the good thing is, not being on the board here allowed me to spend more time doing work with the ACLU and representing people like Alejandro. Let me tell you that folks in our generation, and I'm 64, always get these questions, or maybe we think that, as our parents did, the world was going to hell because these kids are going to be taking over. Well, let me tell you, if the world is going to be taken over by people like Alejandro, it's going to be in good hands. Yep. What we're going to do this morning is talk about a number of issues. I will talk as little as possible because I have the real authorities to my left and right. We're going to talk about issues that are of great relevance to all of us in Kansas, although technically, don't make this a big deal. I live in Missouri. I live a block from Kansas, but I actually do live in Missouri. Forgive me for that. Okay, thank you. He was born in Missouri. So, in any case, since we have the experts here, we're going to be talking about developments, let's say, in the last year or so, and then developments to come in the next year or so. We're going to talk about the soon to occur elections in the fall of 2019, and then of course the primary and general elections next year in 2020. But the first thing I want to do is talk about something that has already been alluded to, and that's the constitutional amendment that's going to be on the ballot this coming fall, in November. I first want to ask Jamie what it's all about and how it might possibly affect those of you who live in Douglas County.
How many of you are aware of the constitutional amendment that's going to be on the ballot? Okay. It is essential for our county. It's essential for our state, but it's essential for our county. We have worked for a couple decades to try to get this on the ballot, and it has not passed the legislature. And thanks to the work of quite a few people in the legislature, we surprisingly got it on the ballot, and we need it to pass. We are the only state that does a census readjustment for reapportionment for our House and Senate seats. So when we do the apportionment for Congress, we use a certain set of numbers. But then the Secretary of State's office has to take all the what are called temporary residents like students, military, and so forth, move them out of the county which they were counted in for Congress and move them back to either their home state or home county. For Douglas County, that means in the last redistricting, we lost about 14,000 residents from our census. That's a house seat is what, 22,000, 23,000, right? So that's over half of a House seat that we lost because of the readjustment. It also costs about $800,000 to do the readjustment. And 10 years ago, the military actually said they weren't going to participate. So the only ones that had to participate were the universities. So it is vital on a number of areas that we make people aware of that ballot issue and also that we vote for it. In Douglas County, one thing for you to know, it is a huge amendment and it cannot be on the front page of the ballot, so it's on the back page of the ballot. So one of the things you're going to hear me say is, remember before you walk out of the booth, turn it around and vote for that amendment, because what that amendment does is it gets rid of the adjustment. It will be like all the other states, and everybody will stay here for all of the redistricting.
Well, good morning. Thank you for having me here. Jamie referenced the work in the legislature. For a lot of us who are represented by the party in this meeting, our work was not saying too loudly how much we like this amendment. Because as Jamie sent me the studies that have been done from the past 3 decades of redistricting, and you can see that Douglas County, Riley County, Lyon County, probably a little bit Ellis and Crawford, thank you, are affected by it too, but the ability to actually count the entire population and have more representatives from those areas goes a long way. And as someone who's, I care about a lot of different policy positions, but 1, it's a better practice electorally, and 2, as someone who serves on the Higher Education Budget Committee, I would like more representatives from our higher education institution counties and being a voice for those policies and anything else. So, as he said, make sure you vote for it. I don't think it will become an issue because it passed almost unanimously through the legislature, but we still want to make sure we all do our due diligence, vote the whole ballot, and get that adjustment made.
Okay, so if nothing else, make sure you vote up or down on this. Personally, I'm not going to campaign either way. I try to remain nonpartisan on these issues as someone who's an instructor at KU. Let me ask Brett about the issues that were considered by the legislature in the past the election-related issues that were considered in the spring 2019 legislative session.
So there's a handful of things that dominated our conversation, at least on the House side. We were able to have a hearing and a vote on a version of same-day registration, election day registration legislation. Unfortunately, it went down mostly on party lines. I don't know if we'll come back to that subject later, but there will be some work to that in this next session. We also had one of the good pieces of policy that was passed is that, I don't know if you all saw after the last election, there were discrepancies from county to county, but I think mostly the comparison was like Johnson County versus Sedgwick County, and how many ballots, mail ballots, were rejected because the signatures didn't match. Whereas Sedgwick County's election commissioner was proactive. If they got a ballot that wasn't signed or the signature looked different than what was on the voting file, they would attempt to contact them and let that voter come in and fix the situation. Johnson County wasn't required to do anything and didn't take that extra step. And I'm sure that played out county by county, but those were the 2 that we heard about the most. So we're able to pass legislation that would allow or require, sorry Jamie, I don't think you guys were doing this already, require that every county make an effort to contact those voters. So if you long ago when you registered to vote and you put in your signature for that, and now your signature looks different. When you sign an advance ballot, we've seen this if people have injuries, if they've had a stroke, or in most cases, they just forget to sign their ballot. We make an effort to contact them. So that was a nice piece of bipartisan legislation. One thing that we fought back this year and we'll watch for next year is as Democrats winning state legislative races in Kansas, a lot of time you win because you work harder and you turn out more people to vote and you talk to every neighbor who's never voted before and you do everything that you can to help get them to the polls or get a ballot in their hand. Under the cover of sort of the North Carolina election fraud, not voter fraud, the chairman of the House Elections Committee pushed a bill this year that would prevent any organization or individual from going around helping people to turn in their advance ballots. So let's say there's, if you have a faith group that's particularly active in the community on turning out the vote, or League of Women Voters, or campaigns that say, we came to Mark's door, we signed him up for an advance ballot, we are coming back to check on him, make sure he's filled it out. We're turning in 20 today from people we've talked to, we can drop it off and save him the cost of a stamp. There is a push to just do away with that entirely, and we were able to push back that legislation this session, but I would imagine something like that will be emerging next year.
Brett, thank you. Jamie, could you tell us what procedures, if any, your office has implemented as a result of recently adopted legislation that might affect how the folks here are going to be voting this year and next year?
Well, there's a couple things. First of all, to touch on what Brett talked about, tried to be a little proactive on advanced ballots if that were to pass, and so I'll be announcing next week that you will no longer need a stamp in Douglas County. We're going to pay for your advanced ballot to be returned. So that starts with this election. It'll have a business reply. Don't worry about a stamp. Drop it in the mail. We'll pay for it. And I think that will help a little bit. But there's always confusion about the stamp. We had an agreement with the post office anyway that if it didn't have a stamp, we would pay for it, so they didn't hold it up. But now we're just going to get rid of that. One of the biggest ones that will happen this year that happened in the legislative session prior was the audit bill. We worked really hard to try to get some sort of audit bill. I would love the ability to audit our elections post-election. And while that audit bill didn't necessarily come out as strong as we wanted it to, we did get it. So we will be required to do a random audit of 1% of our precincts after every election. So we'll be doing that process. As you know, I do everything out in the open, so we'll do it in the commission chambers. It'll happen before the canvass, so we'll be stretching out that time for the canvass a little bit to give us time to do that, but we will we'll be implementing that. So it won't change the way that you vote, but it does, I think, go a long way in helping us in kind of solidifying the confidence in that vote. Up to now, I haven't been able to open those ballots and audit them officially. And probably the one thing that's a huge conversation, and I don't know if we'll dig into a little deeper, is so Senate Bill 130, which allows for what's called vote centers. We will be having a conversation as a community about that because there are pros and cons to that bill. The pro is that you could vote anywhere and it's not precinct based. And that's huge for Douglas County because we have so many people that commute, that are driving out of town and go, hey, I want to vote. The problem with that for me is that in order for that to occur, it means that, so the way that I have security built is what's called air gaps, which is nothing is hooked up to the internet on election day, none of the elections equipment. To have vote centers, we have to get rid of the air gap because you have to have the e-poll books have to talk to each other to make sure somebody can't vote at multiple polling places, which means I have to hook up all my equipment to the internet. That's a huge concern of mine. And it's one that I need to overcome before I go forward with vote centers. And when you talk about it, there are ways that you can get a secure internet connection, but pretty much most of the polling places don't have that, especially out in the county. So does that mean I close those polling places, which I don't want to do and I won't do? But how do we get that secure? And then the other part of that is then kind of the staffing and the working of it. But I would say the biggest concern on Senate Bill 130 for me right now is security. And I need to be comfortable with that before we go forward. So we're probably going to have some town halls and talk about it as a community for the implementation of that, especially with 2020 being so huge. It is an opt-in, so the county gets to decide whether they opt in. So we kind of need to weigh that. Did I touch on all those? Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I think you're probably already getting the idea that voting and counting votes is far more complicated than you might think it should be. But the good things that you folks in Douglas County can rely on is that you have election officials who are on the cutting edge of these issues and really do a great job for you. Now, one of the things that happens is we get these questions, and there's one that is particularly relevant to what Jamie just said, and here's the question. Can party volunteers still give out advanced ballot application forms? Right?
Yes, and just to be clear, the legislation that I was talking about that would apply limitations to collecting the ballots has not gone anywhere. We're just anticipating that it may come back. But What was proposed last time around is what would be limited is not signing people up for advanced ballots, but coming back around to collect the ballot and turn it in for them. The justification that's given for that is because I'm sure most of you have heard about what happened in North Carolina. You had people collecting them and either trying to alter the ballots or just not turning them in. All of that is already illegal in Kansas. What they would be trying to add to that illegal practice is literally me picking up the ballot for Mark with his permission and turning it in for him. Everything nefarious is already against the law. But even should that happen, yes, still take advanced ballot applications to people, get them signed up, and you can still remind them to turn it in on their own. And if you live in a county that will pay the postage for them, all the better.
Brett, you've already told us about one issue that's going to be coming up, or at least you believe is going to be coming up with the legislature next year, and that's the limitation on non-family members picking up collecting advanced ballots. Anything else that you can tell us might be coming up in the next legislative session?
Well, we'll probably have a continuation either in the House or Senate of one of the main conversations we were excited about this past time around, which is election day registration in some sense. And Jamie can probably get into more of the technical details of this, but you have some states that have adopted a policy where you can register to vote any day of the year. You can register to vote on the election day and vote that day. It increases turnout. The numbers I've usually seen are about 5%, which is a pretty massive boost. And you can do that in a way that puts a burden on people like Jamie and the other county clerks and election commissioners, where you are updating poll books and you have to basically update the entire process right there. But what happens right now in Kansas, you can register to vote on election day, but your ballot won't count that day because you have missed the 21-day deadline before that election. So if you walk in to vote and you're not registered, they will walk you through the voter registration process. You will turn that in. You'll be given a provisional ballot. You'll vote a provisional ballot, but the ballot won't be counted because you were past the 21-day deadline. Now, assuming you're otherwise eligible to vote, you are now eligible to vote for every election after that one. You just didn't get your vote counted on that election. So the simpler way, and we can argue whether it's truly election day registration or not, but we would like to institute a policy that says if you've shown up, you've done the paperwork to register to vote, after you've cast your provisional ballot, we verify that you are eligible to vote in this place, that when it comes time to choose which provisional ballots count and don't count, those go from being not counted to counted, essentially, which would eliminate the statistics I've seen after the last election. That process would eliminate, I think, between people moving and not having updated their registration or being first-time registrants, about 80% of provisional ballots that don't get counted. So every time after an election, we see all these votes that people tried to cast that we weren't able to count. This would solve the bulk of them. And I could let Jamie touch on what that looks like more from his end of things, but as we consider the legislation, really simpler is better, and sometimes this may be the first step to helping more people vote in the long term. We could look at sort of the more technical side of updating our poll books on the spot and doing sort of that more burdensome work. But right now, it seems like there's a simplest solution.
Yeah, there's a number of initiatives that I have fought for a very long time, and this is one of them. Same-day registration is huge. It has a huge impact on turnout. Voter registration is the largest barrier for 18 to 24-year-olds to participate. We have a lot of college students that decide they want to vote on election day. And they're coming from states, so now over half the population of the United States lives in a state that has same-day registration. California just went to same-day registration, which kind of put us over the top. So they come from states where that happens. And so they show up and they say, I want to vote. And we say, yeah, you should have registered 21 days ago. It's an arbitrary date. No one can tell me why 21 days versus 7 or 14. It would reduce a ton of stuff for us. Now, you will hear people say, well, that's a lot of work. Well, it's really not. First, we're already doing the provisional ballot. so already doing the work. Second of all, that's our job, all right? I'm never a big fan when you hear election officials that say, well, that's a lot of work. Well, that's what we get paid to do, which is to make sure that people are able to vote. So if it's a lot of work, you figure out how to make it work. But it really wouldn't be a lot of work, it would just count as ballots. In 2016, we had, I think, over 300 people who were registered in other counties in Kansas and were trying to vote here, and it didn't count. So they were registered, they were citizens of Kansas, they were registered somewhere in Kansas, they just were in the wrong county, and we will say to them, how fast can you get back to your county on election day? Because that's the only way that your ballot counts. And that drives me crazy because of a bureaucratic technicality, you don't get to vote. So I think we struggled to get it passed. I think the way to do it is we're going to try maybe a little lighter bill that kind of opens the door, which is what I just talked about, which is at least if you're registered in Kansas, we would count that ballot and kind of go from there. The words same-day registration spooks the legislature, so we'll call it something different. But, you know, I have a friend of mine that ran elections in Cook County, and they have same-day registration. If a county of over 4 million...
Does Cook County have post-mortem registration?
So, he's not a fan of those jokes. He said that was before him. If a county of 4 million can figure this out, which is almost twice the population of Kansas can figure this out. So this is a huge thing that I hope you will push the legislature on because it is big for voters.
I just wanted to touch on one thing too that Jamie said. Right now, under the current law, if someone is registered in Johnson County, has moved to Douglas County, that is where they reside, and they come and try and vote, the only way that they can vote is to go vote at their previous address, which is not any longer their legitimate address. So in essence, we're encouraging them to vote in the wrong place because that's what the bureaucratic barrier requires. So I mean, that's sort of the layers of logic that we're trying to apply to this discussion, and I was getting text messages from Jamie during the legislative discussion, the committee discussion of this bill, and I think he shared my frustration as we would bring up things like this that people are nodding along, seem like fairly common sense things to solve, and then just get the most non sequitur speeches from some of my colleagues on the committee, but still we persist.
There's a famous judge named Richard Posner, who's a federal appellate judge in Chicago. He retired recently. And one of the things he said, he presided over a number of voting rights cases in his 30 years or so on the federal appellate court. And one of the things he said was that every time we create a small hurdle to people voting, we lose people. No matter how small, no matter how insignificant. A signature, not just initials, but a signature. Putting a stamp on a ballot. Filling out a second form instead of just one form. Little things, we lose people. And we now have a system where I firmly believe we lose several percent of the citizen voting age population, in other words, people who are fully eligible to vote, simply because of some of the bureaucratic hurdles that we've created. You can see that Brent and Jamie are both committed to removing as many of those hurdles as possible, and we hope that you will help them in those efforts. Let me ask one of the questions that has been given to me from the audience, and this is what it says. Pertaining to the amendment, I call it the redistricting amendment. I guess it's actually sort of a population counting amendment. How can the Douglas County Democrats help? Do we promote or keep quiet?
That's actually a great question. I was like, this is on tape that I said this is good for Douglas County. That's probably not good. No, that was a huge discussion we had during the legislative session where really we said to many of the Democratic legislators, don't look at it, don't touch it, don't smile at it, don't do anything, because we really struggled to get this passed over the past couple decades because there was a fear that it helped Douglas County and a fear that it helped Riley County. What really helped, and I will give credit where credit is due, is the new Secretary of State. Scott Schwab pushed to get this passed. And part of that was he found out that it cost $800,000 for his office to do it. And he said, that's a waste of money and a waste of time. So he really pushed it. So he was a big partner in that. I think that we educate people and kind of just say, not necessarily that, those 14,000 could be Republican, could be independent, could be Democrat. 18 to 24-year-olds, the largest registration is unaffiliated. It's not Democrat, and it's not Republican. So just to educate people that it kind of doesn't make sense that we have 14,000 people living here that we didn't count in our census and kind of approach it that way.
I would just add to a couple of talking points that I've used just broadly are what Jamie said. It saves almost $1 million out of the state budget. And two, we are the only state in the union that does this. So this is not experimental. We are the abnormality right now. We are just trying to do it like everyone else and save the state $1 million. I think it probably helped the Secretary's motivation that I'm sure this will shock everyone. The previous Secretary of State, while running for governor, did zero planning budget-wise moving forward. There was nothing passed over. So the first meeting we had with the new Secretary of State at the Elections Committee, he was running around rightfully flustered because they had come into office with basically nothing passed off to them. So we would like to help them save $1 million out of the budget.
Well, I'll turn the tables on the moderator. I've always wondered why no one's challenged it legally, or if anybody has ever challenged that process legally that we do, and if it stood.
Which process are we talking about?
The readjustment.
I don't think anybody's ever challenged it because it's in the state constitution. We can't challenge it legally because, at least at the moment, this reallocation, if you want to call it, is of constitutional magnitude, and the only way you can change that is through the process of amending the Constitution. So that's why we have an amendment. Good, that's a good dodge. All right, here's a very important question. I need my glasses again so I can read it. Is it possible to sign up once to automatically receive an absentee ballot for every election? That's a very important question.
That is another initiative that we have that has gone nowhere, which is so right now, if you have a medical reason, you can sign up what's called permanent advance, which means you'll get an advance ballot every election. But if you don't have a medical reason, there's not anything like that. We would like to make permanent advance open for everybody. It just makes more sense. You mentioned paperwork. We have a ton of paperwork in elections. Paperwork can be a barrier, especially if one of the things we talk about in our office is literacy rates. When you say, it's easy to fill out a piece of paper, it's not necessarily easy for everyone to fill out a piece of paper. We would like to make it where, but it has not gone anywhere. Brett can talk about it. But Colorado, if you look at Colorado, they started a reform effort quite a few years ago that has been amazing. And one of the things they did was open up advance like that. They're now an all mail ballot state. But in doing things like that and same-day registration, they got rid of about 90% of their provisionals. So that is something I would love to see passed.
I echo everything that Jamie said. This is one of the first bills that I filed, was to save that paperwork. And the reason was because when I went and knocked on doors, it wasn't overwhelming, but I talked to a lot of people who like to vote by mail, and they'd say, we do it in the primary, we do it in the general, we do it next year for the local, and after that, do we really have to fill out the same piece of paper every time? And unfortunately, the answer was yes. I will say, how many of you are familiar with ksvotes.org? Okay, great. So that's how I signed up this year for.
We've got a hot audience.
Yeah. A bunch of election nerds in one room. That's my kind of crowd. But I signed up for my advance ballots through that because after the first wave of that was you could register to vote at ksvotes.org on your phone, on a tablet. Then they added that you can request your advanced ballots. What I was thrilled to discover this year as I was requesting my advanced ballot for the primary was that all I had to do was check a box on there to at least get it for the primary and the general. I'm still going to have to sign up for more next year or the year after that if I want to, but at least if you want to do those two together. This policy, we've had a hearing, but then refused to vote my first year. My second year, Representative Mary Martha Good, one of my favorite Republicans from the election committee my first term, amended the policy into another bill, and then the chairman, we then voted that bill out of committee, but the chairman didn't like it, so he lost it in his desk drawer and forgot to turn it in to House leadership, and then when we finally called them on it, then it officially got processed, but then never came up for a vote, which, as galling as his quote, losing it in his drawer was, they likely were not going to bring it up anyway. We actually got a promise from the majority leader once to run it, and then the chairman went and got him to take that back and not run it. We also then had a plan to amend that policy and some others into another elections bill, and then the majority leader found out and pulled the other elections bill so that we couldn't vote on it. So things are not always simple to get done in Topeka, but we have nudged the conversation forward each year. There is some bipartisan buy-in. A lot of my colleagues who get elected as more centrist Republicans, doing that hard work in their primaries and signing people up for advanced ballots is how they're able to kind of overcome even their own party's opposition to their election. It would do them a tremendous good to be able to, 1 year, go talk to their voters and sign them up for people who like to vote by advanced ballot, especially in a primary when the turnout is lower. So there is some bipartisan support. I think the challenge is getting the conservative leadership to just let that policy through.
Let me exercise the moderator's privilege and give you an update on 3 cases that are of relevance to voting here in Kansas. The first is what I refer to as the voting rights case, and actually there's already been an allusion to that, or a reference to that case. That's the one where last year we persuaded the federal judge in Kansas City, Kansas, to declare the Kansas law requiring anybody registering to vote to produce a piece of paper proving that they were a U.S. citizen, declare that unconstitutional. That case is now on appeal. The state appealed that decision to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. It was argued in Salt Lake City 6 months ago. We're waiting for the decision. I guess what I can say is we're cautiously optimistic about the result. So that's number one. Number two is a case that was more recently filed challenging a long-standing Kansas law that prohibits any election activity within 250 feet of an open polling place. It's been on the books here in Kansas for a long, long time. The U.S. Supreme Court has decided a case about 25 years ago involving a Tennessee law that limited it to 100 feet of an open polling place, and they found that was constitutional. Kansas has a much larger, particularly if you know the area of a circle, pi r squared, I think is what I remember. That's a lot more than 100 feet, and we're asking the federal judge to declare that to be unconstitutional. We'll probably have a decision on that sometime next year. And then finally, in another case, these were cases that have been brought by the ACLU, as you probably know. Finally, in a third ACLU case, we're challenging the use of the interstate cross-check system. And at the moment, what and Jamie mentioned Secretary Schwab, and here we have to give him credit. At the moment, Secretary Schwab has said he's simply going to suspend Kansas's participation in cross-check until the case is fully resolved. That in and of itself is a good result. We'll see how the case will probably be settled. These cases are terribly complicated. It could last a long time if we fought them all the way through. So it'll probably get resolved amicably, again, probably sometime either later this year or early next year. So I just wanted to bring you up to date on the litigation. And now I have a question to ask Jamie, and this is an important question. Is it possible for an interested citizen to observe the counting of the ballots?
Yes.
How would they go about doing that?
So if you've never been,
A lawyer needs to understand that you only answer the question asked.
so we do everything in the county commission chambers. Makes it difficult because it takes away the chambers for a lot of meetings and stuff. So when we run all of our advanced ballots, we run them in the commission chambers. You can walk in, sit down, I call them pews, I don't know, benches. Right, and I'm a grandson of a Baptist.
First Amendment violation.
Yeah, I'm a grandson of a Baptist minister, so that's what. So you can sit down there, you can watch it. We don't make you go through special credentialing and that type of stuff. So if it's in the polling place that you want to observe, you actually have to be a designated poll agent. But the party can do that. So there's a process to do that where you can be a designated poll agent. But we do everything. We run all of our provisionals. We do the provisional process in the county commission chambers, so you can watch that happen. You can watch the canvass. A lot of people don't come to the canvass. The canvass is actually where the election becomes official. So what happens on Tuesday night is not official, and it is not official until the county commissioners give their stamp of approval. And we go through and we balance to the ballot. So we go through every precinct, and the number of signatures, the number of voters equals the number of ballots, and so forth. So those are all things we do in the commission chambers. If you want to know like when we're doing it and the times we're doing that, you can contact us, but you can just stop by.
Before I forget, I want to spend some time talking about the upcoming redistricting process. You may be interested in that. But I want, again, to exercise my privilege for 1 minute. We've been talking a lot about voting procedures, as you might guess. And here's the teacher in me. I want to spend 60 seconds telling you how we got to have this special type of voting system that we have in the United States. In the late 1800s, in Melbourne, Australia, a new type of voting procedure was pioneered, and it swept the world in a matter of 10 years. So in every democracy, in every true democracy in the world, the same basic voting procedure is used, and it's referred to as the Australian ballot. You walk into a polling place, and what do you see? You see a table with some people sitting at it. You have a book that in front of them, and they check you in to see that to verify that you're an authorized voter. There are representatives of the major political parties sitting there to observe that process. You're handed a ballot. You go to a little place that's enclosed so you can vote in secret. You mark your ballot, you fold it up, you take it to a box, a locked box, and you drop it in that box. No one sees how you have voted. You leave, and at the end of the day, the same election judges open that box, pour the ballots out, and in full view of everybody who wants to, as Jamie just mentioned, the ballots are counted. This system has been in use in the United States now since the 1880s, and seems to work by and large pretty well. So that's where it came from. Now, let's talk about redistricting. First, let's talk about the upcoming census, which is going to be instrumental in the redistricting process. And let me ask Brett what's going to be happening in the next year or so in Kansas on the census process, so y'all are aware.
Well, I'll just touch on a couple of things. We've been watching some of the census questions be litigated at the federal level. One of the frustrating things is the longer that conversation drug out, the least good scenarios there were left, right? We've made such an issue out of the citizenship question on the census that even though the rulings are now going in our favor, there's been this long drawn-out conversation about should you or should you not, participate in the census. From a state perspective, and hopefully this bridges party lines, everyone in Kansas should want everyone in Kansas to get counted. And the reason is because that determines how much federal aid we get for things, it determines our representation in the federal government. It is within every Kansas citizen's interest for every Kansan to be counted, because it really does give us our weight in participating in the federal government and the dollars that come back. I do know the Commerce Department under Governor Kelly has a census preparation task force of some sort. No one botching the name of that. That's trying to actively encourage participation. That's pretty common. Other states do that as well. Thus far, I haven't seen the specifics of it. Did you want us to touch on what the impact of that is after the census is, or?
Yeah.
Okay. So legislatively, once the census is done, the legislature that's elected in the 2020 election will come in 2021. If this constitutional amendment passes and we get in the stop sign.
Let me just step in for a second. And there's a step that of communication between the federal government and the state government. Once the census is completed, and that will be at the end of next year, and the count is certified by the Commerce Department, and the Bureau of the Census is an office in the Department of Commerce. The state-by-state populations are communicated to the U.S. Congress, and the Speaker of the House then communicates with the states to tell them how many congressional seats they get on the basis of the state's respective populations. And then the states use those population numbers not just to work on the congressional redistricting, but also the State House and State Senate redistricting.
Right. So in January 2021, when the next legislature is sworn in, one of the things that will happen is there'll be a special committee to take that data and start drawing the maps. We draw for the State House, the State Senate, the State Board of Ed, our congressional districts. If I'm leaving anything out there, let me know. But it's just like any other piece of legislation. It has to pass. Each of those maps have to pass the House, the Senate, and be signed by the governor. Yes. So one of the greatest protections we have in Kansas against wildly unfair map being drawn for any of those is that we have Governor Kelly and the governor's, well, not the governor, it's your question. So if she vetoes something, we need 42 votes to sustain that veto. Right now, there are 41 House Democrats. However, there's an election before any of this takes place. So if after that next election, the House Democrats gain at least a net of 1 seat, there is a block to basically ensure that the maps are bipartisan. One way or another, governor can say no, we can sustain that as many times as necessary, as long as we're within that 2 years. And that applies to all the maps. The House Democrats can sustain a veto of the state Senate maps. We can sustain a veto of the U.S. congressional maps. In the state Senate, there's 11 Senate Democrats, and it would take 14 to break that law. So there's a chance that after the next election, you'd break the supermajority in both parties, or in both chambers.
The process that Kansas went through in the last cycle, in other words, the 2010, 2011, 2012 process, you might know, went differently because the House and the Senate were unable to agree on legislative maps. By tradition, the House would draw its lines, the Senate would draw its lines for the respective districts, and then they would defer to the other. So the Senate would defer to the House on the House districts, and the House would defer to the Senate on the Senate districts. That didn't happen in 2011. So that's why in 2012, the redistricting issue ended up in federal court, where I was involved in that litigation. I essentially represented the interests of Johnson County, at the time having about 20% of the state's population to make sure that it got 20% of the representatives in the House and the Senate. One of the interesting results of that process, because the lines were drawn by the judges, is that today, and you may find this hard to believe, Kansas is in fact one of the least gerrymandered states in the country. And that's solely because you had nonpartisan judges federal judges who were drawing those lines. I live in Missouri, and the process went differently, and so there are a couple of congressional districts in Missouri that are relatively gerrymandered. Not anything like Maryland and North Carolina were gerrymandered. Those were the two states whose districts were examined in the recent case in which the U.S. Supreme Court decided that the the federal courts should not get involved in making those decisions. So, the upshot of all of it is that redistricting, particularly the issue of partisan gerrymandering, is now for the states. And a number of states, Arizona, California, strangely enough my state of Missouri, and some others, have independent or nonpartisan redistricting processes in place. Arizona and California have had them for a number of years, and it seems to work awfully well. Missouri is going to be doing it for the first time. We'll see how that happens. We'll see how it goes. So, you're going to see a lot of development in the states on the issue of partisan gerrymandering in the next couple of years. Is there, I'm just curious from either of you, is there anything that citizens can do to voice their feelings, their opinions, in the redistricting process?
I'm the one elected to partisan office, so I'll take this part of this. The number one thing you can do is elect a more balanced legislature in the next election. The combination of a Democratic governor and a larger Democratic caucus in either the House or Senate, but preferably both, it is about the most influential thing I think that we can do to ensure that all parties have a seat at the table. And it may be messy, but at the end of the day, not one or the other can just roll the other. If there are less overtly political things that can be done, I'll let Jamie touch on that. Yeah, so vote in 2020.
Vote early, vote often. I think we'll finish up, and we're about out of time. Everybody will be happy to know. On a philosophical question, and I suspect I know the age of the person asking this question. What do you think about a proposal to abolish the minimum voting age and allow kids to vote in elections?
That's actually being discussed in some states. There's some cities on the West Coast that are passing some resolutions to go to 16 years of age to do city elections, and that'll probably end up in court to discuss that. I think it can be a discussion. It's not that long ago that we dropped to 18. That was only in the 70s, so it was 21 before that. I think there's probably some larger issues for us to talk about with ballot access and so forth. You can work as an election worker if you're 16 and above in Kansas now, and I would love to have a lot more 16, 17-year-olds work in elections because I think that will kind of grab them at that moment. But one of the sad things is Kansas kind of lost their funding for kids voting, so we don't really do kids voting much anymore. There's a little bit of it. You can register at 17. So, I'd probably spend a lot of my time on same-day registration and stuff, but I don't know if I have any other cooking thought on that.
I'd echo a lot of what Jamie said. There are probably bigger conversations we can look at for barriers to participation, but I do think one thing to keep in mind is we ask people to start this civic habit at 18, which is one of the biggest transition years in anyone's life. They're usually changing addresses. Everything about life is in flux, and yet we're saying, oh, and now this is when you start this regular practice that we want you to do, hopefully at every election going on. So on the pro side, you could, on limited elections, get some 16 and 17-year-olds developing that habit before everything in their life changes and they're going off to college or starting work and those things. It would be nice to be able to instill that. To Jamie's point that, having the kids vote programs and things like that sort of build the practice, even if it's not really an official vote, are helpful as well.
Let me step on my soapbox on one thing, which is one of my biggest concerns right now is how we frame elections. And so all of our 18-year-olds were born after 2000. In their lifetime, they have heard that elections is broken, elections is filled with fraud, don't vote because your vote's not going to count. Politicians now use election fraud, even those that win. I've never understood how you can say that elections is filled with fraud and win, because then therefore you were elected by fraud, right? But that's all they've heard. So my big fear is more of your 18 to 24-year-olds that are convinced that it doesn't matter. The Pew Center just did a study, and it was like 40-some% of 18 to 24-year-olds said they really didn't think that democracy mattered and that elections mattered. That's a concern of mine, because as they get older, and if that continues, what happens? It is the foundation of our entire system. And if trust in that system is gone, then what happens? And one of the things, I'm surprised we haven't had a question on this, so outside influences, i.e. Russians. If you read the Senate Select report that just came out from the US Senate about what occurred in 16 and 18, part of it was attempts to get into the voter registration system. But the biggest thing that they did was just go on social media and sow distrust of the voting system. And they were successful. I had more people in 16 and 18 accuse me of all kinds of stuff, and they said, well, the internet told me that this, and this, and we would, we'd be able to talk through it. And I think it's good to have a healthy skepticism of people like me. You should question us. But the concern is, I think they were really successful to make democracy seem like a bad thing. And so when we talk about the Russians coming up in the next couple of years, and they'll be behind it, we also know that Iran's behind part of it. Part of it is getting into the system, but more of it is just making us distrust the system and therefore not participate.
I can't think of a better note to end on. Thank you very much.